webinar is now being recorded. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. My name is Lieutenant Commander Teresa Carpenter. Myself and Commander Charlie Dre are the co-hosts for the Eastern Region Public Affairs Mentoring Group. This is our first webinar, so thank you all for joining us. And what we intend to do for the next year or so is meet monthly and have speakers or do field trips in areas of interest and for professional development for the Navy Public Affairs community. So our first guest today is somebody who I very much admire and just so happen to work for at Joint Public Support Element, Joint Planning Support Element Public Affairs. He is the current Operations Chief and Deputy. He oversees public affairs operational readiness and the immediate response force support. He's also a prior Navy commander with 28 years of service. He's done deployments in Pakistan. He's done the support of JTF Lebanon for the evacuation of American citizens. He's also worked International Security Assistance Force operations in Regional Command South. And then upon retirement in 2008, he assumed the current position that he's in today. He's also enlisted in the Navy, earned his commission as a surface warfare officer. I think you're also a prior corpsman. And then you made the lateral transfer to public affairs in March 1995. Since then, you've done tours in Guam. You've done, I think, a 6th Fleet tour as well. And you were also at CENTCOM. So gosh, the list goes on and on. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Nick Balice. And while you're just giving your quick intro, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and pull up your PowerPoint.
Okay. So just a little bit more about my background and why it's so germane to the topic we're talking about today, which is JTF formation. This organization, which we call Gypsy PA, now Gypsy Public Affairs, was, as most of you probably know, formerly JPACE. JPACE was born out of the idea of one of our former CHINFOs, Greg Smith. And the reason the organization was established was because during an exercise millennial challenge and years of observations over responses to joint task forces, it was recognized that the public affairs response to those evolutions was typically ad hoc in nature. There was no single unit that responded. Oftentimes, PA forces were gathered from within theater, never worked together, never did a JTF formation. So it really hindered the ability to get up and running quickly. That's why JPACE was formed. And to this day, even through all of our transformations, our primary mission is expeditionary public affairs and the establishment of joint task forces or joint force commands. Now, the reason I developed this briefing was because a couple years ago, our command went through a specific effort to basically codify the processes and the different timeline events that it takes to establish a joint task force. Could you go to the first slide, please, Teresa?
Can you see the slides?
I cannot.
Okay, so can you see them now?
No.
All right, let me try this.
Now, if everybody else could see him, I have the slides and I can talk to him.
Okay, can everybody see my screen?
I can see your screen, Teresa, with the Zoom in the middle and then your Gmail and all of the other stuff. So I can see it.
Okay, can you see
it?
I can. I just can't see the slides. I'm seeing the same thing you're seeing, but we can't see the slides.
Interesting. Okay, so let me see how I can do this. Okay, can you guys see it now? The slides? Where it says JTF PA organization and functions?
No, it just shows the email. It has
All right.
JPACE, PA has joined your meeting.
Okay, no problem. I'm gonna just give me 1 second. Oh, okay, I see what you guys see. So let me stop the share for a moment and let me do it again. Can you guys see it now?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yep, I can see it.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Over to you, Nick.
So, quick agenda, organization and function, some examples, and then specific timeline tasks. Next slide. Okay, these are the primary references. You're probably familiar with JP 3-61, Public Affairs Joint Pub. JP 3-33 is the Joint Task Force Headquarters doctrinal pub. The update is 2018, but the information is still pretty much the same. And then everything else that comes out of this brief was gleaned from AARs from all the numerous deployments that we've done. Next slide. Okay, so the way this brief is kind of organized, I'm gonna review with you the information that's contained in doctrinal pubs about what JTF Public Affairs is, what they should do, how they're organized. And I'll tell you up front that there's not a lot there. It gives a lot of very basic information, but doesn't get into the weeds on specifically how to organize or develop a JTF Public Affairs capability. Once I go through that, then I'll show you specific by our timeline event sequence that we develop for the numerous deployments we go on. So to start off with, if you're not familiar with it, this is a typical Joint Task Force organization. I know this slide is pretty small, but the bottom line is you've got your J codes, similar to your N codes, and up in the upper left-hand corner, you basically have the staff elements where public affairs should reside, along with, if required, a media operations center. Next slide. Okay, so this is where we go into the information that's discussed in JP 3-33 as to what a JTF public affairs staff should be doing. And it's pretty basic information. The key one of the key things that I found, and I was surprised to find it in there, was the reference to the fact that prior to and upon arrival in the JOA, we should be prepared to surge for public affairs activities. Oftentimes, if you talk to planners or commanders, they don't think about the prior time. They think about when you hit the ground. But in actuality, you need to be prepping for this stuff before you even enter theater. Press is not already in the JOA to cover military activities. JTF may be asked to take the media with them. So we have to be prepared to embed either on ships, in aircraft, whatever, to take them to the scene. And then it breaks down these basic functions that a JTF public affairs staff should be able to do. Planning, execution, it lists in detail commander's responsibilities, assessment, and then those other factors there, MOC, AFRTS, and VI. Next slide. Okay, so public affairs plans. I'll be upfront and I'll tell you if there's a weak spot amongst public affairs officers that comes in the planning department. Typically, when I ask a public affairs officer about plans, they think development of an annex Foxtrot or something like that. And that's just a fraction of it. At our organization, Gypsy Public Affairs, the JPSE stands for Joint Planning Support Element. So in large part, we're an organization of professional joint planners that are very familiar with the joint planning process, and they go out to combatant commands and components, help develop operational plans, strategic plans, and work them through the every phase of the joint planning process. For a public affairs officer, we need to be integrated in all of those phases, because if you go in 3-61, they'll show you that public affairs has input in just about every phase of the joint planning process. We need to be able to support P2C2WGs. If you're not familiar with that, basically, they're all the working groups. Boards, bureaus, cells, and working groups. Once again, that's where public affairs is typically lacking because of capacity. We don't have the capacity to put a PAO in all of those working groups, but we need to be in there to help shape how they develop plans. Advise on potential implications of operational decisions, shape the environment, prepare JTF to work with media prior to arrival in the JOA. These are all things that could take place beforehand, but definitely as part of an OPT or a planning cell. Now, the last bullet may get some people nervous, but particularly as you look at how the joint force is changing to information as a joint function, we need to be able to coordinate with other communication efforts like MISO, PSYOP, Civil Affairs. Now, when we say coordinate, we don't necessarily mean get in bed with him, but what we're saying is that when you develop a plan, develop a narrative, develop a message, you need to be synchronized. So we need to know what other information capabilities are doing so we can avoid things like information fratricide. We understand what they're supposed to be doing, what audiences they're talking to, and we can decipher between the two. Any questions on this slide? Okay, next slide.
And if you
Now,
guys have any
JP
questions, feel free to speak up. I'm sorry, just
Yeah,
wanted to.
absolutely. Now, these are, if you go to JP 3-33, these are all listed as commander's responsibilities. But we as public affairs officers know that typically, particularly if he has confidence in you, these responsibilities are going to be shifted down to the PAO. We just have to have the clear understanding that ultimately it's the commander that's responsible. I'll let you read through these real quick and then I'll highlight a few. There's nothing really surprising here. I'm sure you've done most of this stuff. Some of the points that we'll get to in more detail in future slides are things like designate an officer to accomplish security review of imagery. That's not a PAO, that's who in your N2, who in your J2 is going to take on that function to make sure that what you're releasing is cleared. Any questions on this slide? Like I said, most of this, you are all experienced public affairs officers, so you should be pretty familiar with this. Next slide. Okay, these are the other 3 items that are listed in 3-33. And the only one that you may not be familiar with is AFRTS, which, to be honest with you today, the importance of this is probably less and less because everything's so digital and the way we get, entertainment is a lot different. But if you were planning for a long duration joint task force, like something we did in Afghanistan or Iraq, where you're going to have forces there for a long period of time, then you would have an AFRTS representative that actually supports your command and does an assessment and builds out what kind of capability they need to provide long-term entertainment and broadcasting for the internal office audience within your command. That's what AFRTS would do. The other things you're familiar with: establish a mock and conduct visual information. Next slide. Okay, now this is where I transition into where did we get our experience and what process do we go to actually establish a JTF capability when we respond to a contingency. One of the things that I realized as a PAO was that you can go through a career and have maybe 1 or 2 pivotal events where you have to respond to a contingency or a major operation. The unique thing about our command is that's all that we do. This list right here, it's about a quarter of the operations that we've supported since our inception in 2005. But these are all the ones that were specifically JTF-like, where we went in there and we stood up either the full capability or a good portion of the capability. The Pakistan earthquake in 2005 was our maiden deployment when I got to Joint Public Affairs Support Element and stood it up. And I'll talk about that in detail later. But if you look at all of these, there's a lot of DISCA in here, but there's a lot of other stuff thrown in combat operations. Joint Task Force 435. We stood up the Joint Task Force rule of law in Afghanistan. We were the entire JTF public affairs capability. Same thing in Pakistan. If you look at, let's see, which one do I want to point out? Oh, Monrovia, Hurricane Matthew. That was an interesting one because our command went there. We thought we were going to be providing support for additional forces. We turned out being the entire JTF capability. Every director, every J code was filled by a JPSC representative, and we conducted the entire public affairs operation. OIR, Mosul, when we were fighting Mosul to free Mosul, we got a call from the ATSD for public affairs saying we need support. So we sent a team in there working with the Iraqis and the US forces over there to stand up that JTF. The most recent one, International Maritime Security Construct, that was a international JTF that was stood up by NAVCENT in 2019. We went there and stood up that entire capability. So the reason I show you this list is nothing that we do in standing up a JTF is rocket science. And it's nothing that any of you have not done in previous missions. The difference is when you do something repetitively, you can determine what steps are routine, what the timeline should be like, so that when you hit the ground, you've done it numerous times, you have a checklist, and you just go through the process. If you go there the first time and you've never done one of these before, the first week or so, you're caught up in the chaos trying to figure out what's going on before you even start putting the pieces in place. And that's where we come into play. Next slide. Okay, so what does a Joint Task Force Public Affairs capability look like? Invariably, if a contingency happens somewhere around the world, and we're presently working on one right now, we're going to be sending a team to Honduras to help them with that hurricane relief effort. The first thing the PAO starts talking to me about is numbers. How many people? The first question I ask is what capabilities? And every time you look at a situation like this, you need to look at capabilities, not numbers. The reason I say that is the capabilities you require will be the same on every operation. The extent of the operation and the extent of the media interest will determine the numbers you need. But if you look in this and all the next examples, you'll see they all have the same things. They have basically a media ops capability, a plans capability, a social media capability, an assessment capability. And then of course, your headquarters element, i.e. the PAO and the deputy, a jock watch, etc. That's consistent throughout every JTF I've worked, every mission I've worked. If you go to the next slide, this is one from the International Security Force, Afghanistan. It's bigger, 37 positions. If you look at the capabilities, though, they're the same. The only thing that changes is because of the extent of the operation and the extent of the media attention, you require more capacity. The other thing that'll impact this is whether you're planning on 24-hour operations or not. The other thing I want to point out in the previous slide, could you just go back one slide real quick, Teresa?
Sure.
If you look at the color coding on this, RCENT as CENTCOM's Army component was directed to establish this JTF. You'll see them listed in some of these positions. If you look at the gray positions with the black border, those are JPACE, now Gypsy PA positions. So this is what typically happens, and what we do in response to an operation like this is a component will be directed to establish the JTF. There's not a component around that has sufficient public affairs capability to stand up a full-fledged JTF. So what do? They call in support. They call in joint plugs and public affairs support, and that's where we fall in. We bring a 6 to 7 person team to do a jump start on this capability, and then as other forces flow in, we flow out. But we can help stand up this capability. Next slide. Okay, so I showed you one from ISAF. Now I have a list of, I've got a library of probably about 20 of these different examples that all come within Iraq and Afghanistan. Same capabilities, different size, depend on location. Next slide. Now, this is a slide that our command developed when our general tasked us with developing what we thought would be basically the ultimate capability that we needed if we had all the assets we need. And if you look at the way this is made, once again, we get back to the same thing. What are the capabilities? You've got the PAO, the deputy, plans, social media, assessment, VI, and a media operations center below. Same thing as all the other constructs, only a little different scale. Now, the other offices that I have outside, this is in the event that you went to, for instance, a full-fledged combat operation. What other offices would you want to tie into and have a PAO there if it was possible? Coalition headquarters, absolutely. U.S. Embassy, absolutely. As a matter of fact, if you were to ask me, what is one of the primary things I would do when establishing a JTF public affairs capability, OCONUS, it would be to embed one of my PAOs in the embassy if I had the potential to do that. Because the linkages they create do so many things to enhance your coordination of message across the State Department, help you work with host nation, et cetera. These others, it depends. It's a matter of how much capacity you have. Certainly, if you're doing combat operations, you would want a PAO in the siege of Sodef. But once again, that's all situational. The thing about this model that you can take with you is you can scale this down. As long as you know what capabilities you need, then you can, for instance, you could strip down the deputy to 1, plans to 1, visual information you can get from other sources. So this will basically help you build a joint manning document. Any questions on this slide?
Hey, Nick, this has been just curious. So do you guys just look at this and you say, hey, we're going to be, I guess, service agnostic with these billets? Do you care? Or do you find that based on history that some billets, perhaps maybe the Air Force or the Army kind of fill them better? Or do you guys don't worry about that over?
I'll get into that a little bit later when we look at different service public affairs. But as far as this, no, it's agnostic. And I think Teresa could probably tell you, just having been at Gypsy PA for a short period of time, once you get the appropriate amount of joint training and socialization across the different services, it really is service agnostic. The only thing that you're going to look at is depending on the type of operation you're doing, and we do the same thing with our planners. If it's real maritime heavy, obviously you're going to want to have some PAOs that have that flavor. Likewise, if it's Air Force heavy, you're going to want to have some Air Force PAOs because there are a lot of specifics with regards to how do you gain access to certain aircraft? What qualifications do you need? So yes, that's important. But as far as the actual public affairs capabilities and a generic JTF, I'd say surface agnostic, really. But what you're going to run into is a service component is going to be tagged with being the core of the JTF. So you're going to be building around that. So you're going to want to get an additional joint plug to have the variety that you need. Does that answer that question?
Yeah, it does. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Next slide. Okay, so this is where the brief shifts. And if you will, this is pretty much a template for how we do deployments. The rest of the planners in our organization, they started looking at, from mission start. For us, a lot of our most valuable work has to be done pre-deployment. So depending on where we're going to support, first thing we're going to do is we're going to be coordinating with the combatant command and OSD to see what guidance they've developed. Have they been talking about it? Is there any State Department guidance? The next thing we do, and this is one that a lot of people wouldn't think of, we coordinate with the Divots Hub before we deploy. And then what this does for us is, number one, if they have a web page established for that operation, we're aware of it. If not, they could start one. The other thing we do is we get the satellite coordinates. So as soon as we hit the ground, if we have to connect, it's a lot easier for us to do. Interagency coordination, USAID. This is huge for OCONUS FHA type operations. Every one of the operations that we've done, we've linked up with the USAID public affairs officer and worked side by side with them. Same thing with the embassy. I already mentioned the importance of linking up and embedding in the embassy if possible. The only difference here is, depending on exactly where you're going to be in the food chain, it could be the component that's doing initial interaction with the embassy PAOs. Certainly when you hit the ground, you're going to want to do that. And then identify and delegate team roles. This is something that's very specific to our organization, but certainly as a PAO, you ought to be looking at your team in the same way. You understand your team's capabilities, strong points, weak points, personalities. And when a contingency like this happens, you shouldn't have to stop and think about who's going to do what. As soon as you hit the ground, those people should know what they're going to take care of, and then they go forth and they start working it. Because in the chaos of the moment, you're not going to have time to take a lot of time and discuss it. You're going to be pulled left and right. Your chief of staff's going to be pulling you in, and you're going to have to get things started all independently of one another. Next slide. Okay, first 24 to 48 hours. My team has gone over these things numerous times, and you can quibble over adding one or taking one another, or looking at the specific timelines. But the bottom line for these events here is, in my experience and my team's experience, these are things that you actually have to do within the first 24 to 48 hours, or else you're rapidly going to cede advantage in the information environment. Conduct public affairs assessment, environmental assessment. Some of this may have been done before you deploy. If you do, you're going to want to get that. If not, we do just what you call a hasty assessment. That's getting with your intel guys, getting with the embassy, say, hey, what are the atmospherics like? Brief the commander. Once again, this is one that's unique to us, because we've been in a situation before where we have a team of 6 PAOs that hit the ground. They didn't know we were coming. We come in pretty high rank when we roll in there, and they're surprised. So the first thing we do is we sit down, talk to either the chief of staff or the commander, basically say, this is who we are. This is our capabilities. This is what we think needs to be done now, from the initial standpoint moving forward. And then, of course, get the commander's guidance as far as his priorities. The other thing this does for you is this gets you immediate buy-in if you need force access, i.e. you need space on helicopters. If the commander's not seeing eye to eye with you, that communication is important. You may not get those seats. If he pushes out to his staff that, look, impression and message is important as the operation, his staff is more likely to support your requirements. Develop and validate a 7-minute drill for press release and information approval. If you're not familiar with a 7-minute drill, it's basically just a template. Army's known for these. It's a template that talks about, it'll say, this is the meeting. These are the people that should go. These are the inputs they should bring. The intent of this meeting is to develop certain outputs. So all this is saying is that you need to work with the staff really quickly to determine what the approval process is going to be, who needs to review this information before you could release it, to make sure that when you get in a crisis situation, all of a sudden you're not log jammed because the J3, the chief of staff, everybody else thinks they need to sit on this release. So you need to get that iron off real quick. Integrate with the command group and ID staff networks and processes. Just like any other Navy staff, public affairs isn't an independent operation. It requires input and information from all the other J codes, the J2, the J3, the J4, etc. So you need to get to know them. They need to understand their public affairs officer. Obviously, what networks do you need? I can tell you that most OCONA stuff, working with USAID, etc., they work on unclassed networks. So military commands often have to learn how to work on open networks when they're really used to working on SIPR. Set up a watch capability in the Joint Operations Center. I already talked about the importance of integrating with the embassy. If you had to ask me my next most important position, it would be the JOC watch. Too frequently, people either forget or don't worry about getting a seat in the JOC, or they put somebody there, that's not their rock star, but we've got to put them in a watch station. The problem with that is that's the nerve center. That's where you get all your information, especially on a very fast moving, rapidly established JTF when they're trying to figure things out. You need one of your best PAOs in that watch center to get information as quickly as possible so that you know what the priorities are and where the command's going. Establish media desk operation, obviously. Coordinate PPAG. Once again, like I said, OSD and the combatant command may be working on this. If not, when you hit the ground, you may have to provide input to it. And then all your typical logistics stuff. You need space, you need computer access, etc. Any questions on this? The other thing I would say with that slide, it's not a sequential list. If you understand your team, when you hit the ground, different people should be working on all these different requirements simultaneously to make sure you can get up and running as soon as possible. Because at the same time you're doing this, if you have an experience like I did in Pakistan, you've got media officers standing outside the tent as well because you've got 60 media that are stacked up waiting to talk to you and the commander who haven't even stood up a command yet. Next slide. Okay, and this is the first 96 hours. And the reason for a lot of this, it's not necessarily one of importance. It's that you as a PAO have to understand that at the same time you're developing all these requirements, your staff is just getting established. Your chief of staff is just getting the command staff situated. The JOC watch is just getting organized. They're just getting their comms down. They're developing a battle rhythm because they don't even know what their battle rhythm is going to be yet. They may think they know what their battle rhythm is, But then they meet with the ambassador, and the ambassador says, no, this is when we're going to have our meeting. So you're going to fall in line with us. So these things take a little bit longer to develop. As a result, establish PA battle rhythm. You can't really develop your public affairs battle rhythm until you understand what the command's battle rhythm is, because you have to be integrated with them, and you need to have your meetings at a time where then they can provide subsequent inputs that fit in with the rest of the commander's battle rhythm. Communication synchronization working group. You're probably all familiar with something like this. This is something that we try to export to all the combatant commands. It's just a formalized group where we bring in all the representatives from across the command that have input into anything information related. So the Intel folks are going to be there, IO folks are going to be there, J4, Chapman will be there. It's basically the hub where you prioritize specific information requirements. Establish a social media presence, obviously. But with regards to JTF, one of the things you have to consider with social media is, what are you going to do? Are you going to tag on to the combatant command's social media profile? Are you going to stand one up as a JTF? Because that's pretty time and labor intensive. So you have to think about how you're going to do that. Coordinate with Department of State, embassy PAOs, and interagency reps, obviously. Coordinate with partner nation militaries. A lot of this is going to be done through the embassy. They'll provide that introduction, if you will, and then depending on what nation you're working with, they may have skilled PAOs or they may not. You may have to help them quite a bit. Integrate into operational planning, imagery release, things that you're all familiar with. And then ensure all component personnel are familiar with approved PAG operational themes and talking points. And let me just check one thing here. Okay, this is where I'm going to go off a script, and I'm going to talk. We'll go to the next slide. Additional actions. Okay, develop a JMD. This is where you revert back to those models that I showed you, because if it's going to be a long duration JTF, then you're going to need enduring support, and you're going to need to build out that manning document. It may require coalition presence. The situation will dictate, but you'll need to develop this so that you can have long-standing support coming in throughout the JTF, which, you know, we've got a lot of JTFs that have been in existence for years, and it's just a rotation of forces. Establish a credentialing process. This is something that I've only seen this with regards to combat operations in Iraq. When we're going into a country and we're basically taking over, and then it's up to us to credential anybody that comes in. Any other time you work, you're going to work through the embassy if there's any kind of credentialing, because they're basically going to acknowledge whether they're valid reporters or not. You're not going to have to worry about that. Media tracking log, absolutely. Assessments, yes. Once again, this is one of those things that initially you're going to rely on the combatant command for assessments, reach back. But the longer duration it is, ultimately you're going to develop your own capability. So this is where I'll go off script now, and I want to talk to you as Navy PAOs. Just inherent in the term Joint Task Force, we're referring to a military operation that includes multiple U.S. services. So what does that mean? You as a Navy PAO and you could be out on an ARG or a carrier strike group, whatever, or just a component, you're tagged with being the JTF. But now you have an operation where you're going to have different services, different capabilities. And I like to refer to it that you're more the orchestra director than you are the musician. So how do you acquire and coordinate all these different public affairs capabilities from different services to support all these different forces that are coming in for this operation? And the example I'm going to use is the deployment I did to Pakistan when we stood up JPACE. Major earthquake in Pakistan. The significance of Pakistan at the time was because right next door we were in Afghanistan, and they were a vital partner to us, so we had a lot of interest in that region. An ARG commander, then Admiral Lefevre, was tasked to be the JTF commander. So he hits the ground with his staff of Navy and Marine Corps officers, most of them, 04, 05. And they got this joint plug from our command, which included 40 planners and 7 public affairs officers. So we hit the ground and we're developing this JTF from the ground up. Now, what kind of forces did we have come in to actually support the operation? We had an Army helicopter detachment that flew in from Afghanistan. We had an Air Force CRG, if you're not familiar with that, it's a contingency response group. That's a team that comes in, they get to an airport, they immediately can coordinate tons and tons of relief that comes in, palletize it, segregate it, control the shipping, control entry and exit from the airport. So they did that. We had Army engineers that rolled in, and we had an Army MASH unit that rolled in. Where in there do you spell public affairs or Navy public affairs? None of the capabilities that we had supporting us were Navy. They were all other services. So how did we coordinate that? Are you trying to coordinate all the public affairs activities and do all the response for those different service elements? The answer is no. Ideally, what you want is those different service components to bring in organic public affairs capability with them. So the CRG brought a public affairs officer. The Air Force element or the Army Helo element brought in a PAO, and they brought in a ComCam element with them as well. We reached out to the Army component when the engineers came in and they said, hey, you need to send an organic PAO with that unit because we don't have the reach. So at the end of the day, what we did was the 7 PAOs from JPACE that were the core of that JTF brought in all that other capability, and we were the orchestrators of the public affairs campaign using all those other service elements. And the other thing you have to do as a Navy PAO in a joint environment is you have to divest yourself of your parochial nature. Because when you go into an environment, typically as a Navy PAO, you're thinking your Navy chain of command, you're thinking CHINFO. Well, when you get in a joint environment, that automatically changes. Now your allegiance is to the combatant command. It's not even to your component. It goes straight up to the combatant command. So as a PAO, you're not looking at the Navy story. You are, but you're looking at the Army story. You're looking at the Air Force story, and you're asking yourself, how do I sell this joint story? Because that's what it is. So you have to leverage all those capabilities to deliver a common message about DoD providing this support. Now, as you do this, you're smart. You're not going to divorce your service. So as you send information up, you do in parallel to your service chain. So everything that we would send up to the combatant commander to OSD in parallel, we're sending it up to CHINFO, we're sending it up to SAF-PA, we're sending it up to ACPA, because they all have a vested interest in this story. So that's how you bring it all together and turn it into a joint operation. Any questions on that?
Actually,
Okay,
Nick,
the other part of that story, yeah.
I was going to say, I just have a very quick question, and we're getting a little close to the top of the hour. Just want to let you know, but very quick, is it in the 3 Tax 6.1 sort of the justification for the different sections in a joint task force? Like we mentioned, the plan section, the media section, the assessment section. Is there anything codified so that when we're trying to stand up a joint task force, even on a component level, sometimes when we have to stand up a mock, is there something that's codified that we can on paper to say this is what we need and why?
No.
Okay, I didn't
Pretty
think
simple
so,
answer.
but
And
okay.
it's pretty interesting that you mentioned the mock, because 2 years ago, I went through a concerted effort to get something doctrinal. And I went to DINFOS and I said, what do you have on a mock? And they said, well, nothing. So there's really nothing that's doctrinal that'll tell you this is what you have to do to stand up a mock. What you do is you get those generic capabilities, as I outlined ahead of time, that says you have to support planning, you have to support media operations, which is why I put together this briefing and why we have basically the checklist that we do to show you how to do it. But the other thing I wanted to tell you about this Pakistan story that you may find interesting is that when we hit the ground at 4 o'clock in the morning, we went there and we relieved the lone PAO that was there from NAVCENT, then Lieutenant Charlie Brown. When I rolled out of there 4 months later, I was relieved by a Navy captain, now Secretary of the Navy, Braithwaite. So a little history to that, and but it just shows you how throughout the Navy PA community, there's a lot of knowledge and a lot of vested effort into this kind of capability. Next slide. Okay. Now I think they're going to have the slides, right, Teresa?
Yes, I'm going to provide the slides after the call as in addition to a link with the recording.
Nothing on here should surprise any of you, with the exception of the one thing that I point out all the time. It's with regards to Sitreps. There's always 2 types of Sitreps that we do. Obviously, the daily public affairs Sitrep, which goes from the JTF level, and in my case, it went all the way up to OSD because of a very high profile JTF, so that everybody knows what we're doing, what's on schedule for tomorrow, etc. If there's any national media engagements. But the other one is there's an internal command Sitrep that your commander will send out that every J code has input in. And if the PAO isn't providing input into them, shame on them, because this is where the rest of the world learns what the command's doing and what their priorities are. And especially now with as important as information is in the operational environment, you have to have your input in there because you should be driving a lot of actions. Next slide. Okay, all this slide does here is this depicts some of the specific actions and products you need to coordinate with other J codes. So your team needs to be versed across the J codes, across the command, not only working things, but getting support from them, providing them input. It's a good checklist. Next slide. Okay, before I go to questions, finally, I will say one thing. If any of you find yourself in a situation where you are with a component and you're tasked to stand up a JTF or respond to a contingency, you should have us on speed dial, because that's our job. Our job is to go out and support other service organizations standing up JTFs to provide that joint plug and make it easier for them to make their commander successful. Open it up to questions.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and hit stop share. So we're going to go back to our view of everyone. Thank you so much, Nick. I thought that was a very good brief. I'm going to open it up to you guys. Is there any questions that you guys have?
Oh, go ahead. Was that Ben or who was that?
No, that was me saying, come on, give me some questions.
All right. Well, this is Charlie, Commander Dre again. For everybody on the call, you don't know when there might be some type of an event that's going to happen that may be a JTF flavor that you may get the call for. I know last year for me, when I was at CSG4, we're doing an exercise and then Dorian hits, and we switch from training environment to operational staff, and then a major foreign assistance kind of a mission where you're doing a foreign disaster assistance stuff. And we had a contingency response group that came aboard the large deck amphib. They had their PAO with them. Coast Guard had a big part in that. And though, we weren't per se a JTF, there still was a lot of coordination that occurred. And I was the senior PAO afloat. So there was the working with the Air Force, working with the Coast Guard. And then there was the Army team that was set up in Florida, where Northcom had set up underneath GIFLIC, who was kind of running things. So you had the NAV North, also known as Fleet Forces Command. You had R North, GIFLIC, and coordination happening, and that was out of the blue. So you just don't know. And then for Richland, with you being in the job you're at Surfland, it's probably more so, Amelia at ESG2, but there could be that something happens, and from your experience at ESG2, I think you had gotten to ESG2 for about 2 minutes, and then you were out on a large deck amphib doing a contingency thing. So it's not out of the realm of the possible. And for you, Ben, this is a great conversation, and there's applicability for the next job. And as you continue to move up, what you find is there's your Navy component hat you're wearing, and depending on where you're at, there's probably also a joint component. And with that, there's always that possibility that you're going to be folding in on something where Gypsy's at. So more of a discussion observation point, but just this is really relevant, really timely, especially during we're finishing up the hurricane season from hell, known as the 2020 season. There's a lot of things going on. We have a pandemic that's occurring around the world. And the neighborhood hasn't really gotten much better in the hot spots. And if nothing else, with great power competition, there's more potential for JTF kind of events to occur. So Nick, I just wanted to say thank you very much for taking the time to kind of discuss things with us and to go over your experience and then the layout and all of the steps it takes to do a JTF. These lessons are something you can take into if it's a Navy Marine Corps only kind of an event, or if it becomes a joint thing. This is all super relevant. I don't know, anybody else got anything for Nick? And Nick, I just really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you.
Yeah,
No problem.
And I'm just going to close out too by saying this is a big part of the APR plus M. So if you are entering the board, you will be asked, as Michelle can attest to, you will be asked how to stand up a joint task force. What are some of the considerations to keep in mind when standing up a joint task force? So I would like to think that this helped answer some of those questions, because I know that for many of us, including myself, who's never stood up a JTF, been a part of a JTF, but haven't had to go stand one up on short notice, there's a lot of education out there that Nick's providing for us. So really appreciate that, Nick. over to you to close it out. And we're at the top of the hour, so don't want to take up any more time than 1 hour for these calls. So, but thank you very much, and over to you for any parting words.
Nope, appreciate it. I'm still Navy at heart. JTF is what we do. We're not experts at everything, but we just have probably a lot more experience. So I'm happy to share this, and would do it in any other form. So appreciate the opportunity.
Well, awesome. Thank you all for joining us. Like I said, we'll have a link for this after the call. So if anybody asks you about it, we will have that provided. I'll get that out to you guys in the next few days. And stay tuned for December. I'm thinking December will still be a remote one, but my hopes are that coming into the new year, we can do some of these in person again, because I think that's also equally important. If you guys know of anybody that's willing to host a field trip to their office, we are taking requests. We've got one person so far who's willing to do that, and I think there's a lot that can be gleaned from visiting other people's office spaces and learning about their day-to-day. So I think that's another part of the program that we definitely want to incorporate. All right, well, we're going to sign off for now. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you guys next time. Have a great evening.
I'll see you in the morning.
Yes, you'll see me tomorrow.
Hey, thanks, everybody. Thanks for
Take care.
coming out and
Okay. Thank you.
participating.
Okay,
Bye.
bye.